Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Just giving you a quick introduction to today's episode, which is actually going to be what we'll just call a twofer preview. We're going to put two things together for you here for today's episode that I think you might find interesting, and we'll let you know some of the other things that are out there while we have some other new episodes coming here on the main podcast feed. The first of those previews is actually going to be episode 1 from our Late Bronze Age Collapse series. That's something that we're doing exclusively for our patrons over on Patreon. But just to give you a sample of what it is, we're going to go ahead and post episode 1 of that special series here on the main feed. There are already 4 other episodes of that series over on the feed for patrons. So if you find the first episode interesting, you can find your way over to our Patreon feed at www.patreon.com/aforkintime. There'll be links in the show notes, and you can see how you can hear the rest of those through how we've made that available to you. After the break, after we have that episode, we're going to actually bring you what we're calling, I guess for lack of a better term, the inaugural episode of The Room Where It Happened. It's not actually the first full episode. That's the episode that's entitled Room Number 1. But what this little snippet will do is give you a better introduction into The Room Where It Happened, how it works, what it's about, and a chance to see what's going on there. So today you're going to get a preview of what's going on our patron feed with the Late Bronze Age Collapse series, and also a preview of episode, or not just episode 1, but actually the Room Where It Happened, the inaugural episode there. By the way, Room Number 1, the first full episode, is available now on the Room Where It Happens feed, and there'll be links for how you can get to that particular podcast in the show notes as well. So hope you enjoy these two little quick previews, and that lead you to something that you'll enjoy in the future. Thanks.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcoming you to this first of a series of episodes in our special Late Bronze Age Collapse series. If you're listening to this episode, that means that you're one of our patrons on Patreon, since we're producing this special series particularly for that group of our listeners, those that support the show by being patrons on Patreon. So first of all, we want to say thank you for not only supporting the show through listening and the other ways that you do, but also providing some financial support for the show. And we hope that you find this particular series to be of interest. We thought it would be a good way to take advantage of the Patreon platform to produce a series, again, that would be special content. And we thought that this was the type of event, this was actually the type of historical what-if that deserved the treatment of a series. The Late Bronze Age Collapse, as we're going to be setting up today in this initial episode, which is giving more of the setting, again, of the Late Bronze Age Collapse, particularly talking about the potential causes of the collapse itself, is the type of thing that really can't be covered well in a single episode, because there are a number of different possibilities. The size, the geographic scope, as well as the cultural scope and the historical scope of the collapse is so large that a single episode would not be able to do it justice. So we thought it was an ideal thing to handle as a series, and wanting to do something special again for our patrons, we thought a series would be the good way to do that, both to reward our existing patrons and, of course, maybe attract some new folks who would be intrigued by the concept and would take advantage of this series as being a good reason to choose to take on the role of being a patron. So whether you're a long-standing patron or whether you're new and you've just joined for this series, whatever the case might be, As always, we want to issue that thank you to you, and we appreciate you being part of what we do here at A Fork in Time, and particularly being a part of this series. The goal today, I already did a little bit of a why type of thing on the main podcast feed, so I don't really want to repeat too much of that today. What I really wanted to focus on today in this episode is actually providing some of the rest of the historical background. So it's a little bit more about what is the Late Bronze Age, what is the Late Bronze Age collapse, but more importantly, focusing a little bit today on the potential causes of the, and I'm going to use the word event here. Event is actually almost too small of a term. It's almost too small of a noun to be applicable to what we're talking about here. As we're going to discover, the more that we unfold this in terms of looking at the historical what-ifs, even as we talk about the historical what did here, that's continuing to set up the series, the what-ifs, we'll find that this is a major, major event in history. And again, I'm somewhat surprised the more people that I talk to who I know are savvy when it comes to their history because of when it is, in terms of history, in terms of the areas that we often spend time talking about and being exposed to. I think it's one of the more overlooked major events in history. And we'll talk a little bit about even today when we're talking about the cause as to why it's overlooked, partly because there's still a lot of disagreement among historians and archaeologists about the event itself, but even more importantly about what the actual causation of the event is. And so again, today's episode is not going to go down any of the historical what-ifs. That's something that we're going to reserve for the series of episodes that we have where we look at individual elements of the what-ifs, because they are, again, widespread, far-reaching in their scope in terms of not only the areas that were impacted during the particular time of the event of the Late Bronze Age collapse, but also how history would flow in general and how it would flow in very specific ways from that point on for the what-ifs. As we often do here on A Fork in Time, it's necessary for us to establish a good, solid what-did foundation in order to be able to pivot off of that for the what-ifs. And so that's going to be the purpose of today's episode, is to establish a little bit more of the setting for the Late Bronze Age, and the setting for the particular event of the collapse itself, talking about some of the actual things that occurred during the collapse, and really focus on some of the theories and hypotheses that have been developed around what is the cause of the collapse. Because as we begin to talk about the historical what-ifs, being able to understand how we might have been able to avoid the causal factors is obviously an important part of that, but it also plays into understanding what happened, and thus, if we look at historical what-if, what did not happen. So I hope that this episode today provides a good foundation, a good start, so that as we go down each of the individual what-if episodes that follow, we can refer back to this and have a good solid basis and not have to repeat that material over and over again as we're looking at the historical what-ifs. So for the episode today, we're primarily going to focus on four things. One is establishing the scene or the setting as we get to the Late Bronze Age. We're going to establish what is the nature and the component of the Bronze Age, which becomes so important in establishing what it is, but also what happens during the collapse. We're going to talk about the particular players, if you will, the empires, civilizations, the other people groups that are impacted by the collapse. In other words, what empires collapse, what civilization collapse, sort of what was and then what is not, is an important part of that. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're going to focus on the causal factors and the fact that there are a number of different causal factors that we have to consider together. So those are going to be our four broad areas that we focus on today. And so let's quit talking about it. Let's start doing it. So again, the first of those is actually talking about what is the Bronze Age? What is the characteristic of the Bronze Age? Generally defined by historians, it's a prehistoric period. The term prehistoric there meaning before writing. Although during parts of the Bronze Age, particularly the latter portions of the Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age, something we're going to be talking a lot about, there is some what's known as proto-writing, or the beginning of the types of things that produce written records. But for most of the Bronze Age, we do not have the benefit of writing that we at least not writing that we have possession of today or that we understand today. And so it falls in that period of being prehistoric. So the things that are recorded about the events that occurred during there, the civilizations that exist, are all the result of archaeological discoveries or other traditions, legends, other things that are carried down in various forms, since it's not overlapping during the period where there's extant writing that's going on during that particular point of time. But it is the period of time that sees the rise of a number of civilizations. And we see that obviously with the development of writing. We see that in moving towards agricultural and city-state types of scenarios where it's not small groups of people that are spread apart in tribal areas or in small settlements, but we have the rise of larger city-type structures, the city-states that we see in Mesopotamia, and we have the rise of civilizations that are brought about by the domestication of animals, but also by the actual use of agriculture intentionally moving towards farming and being able to support larger populations and to support city-type environments, more urban type of environments, because of the ability to produce enough foodstuffs for a mass of people, for larger populations. And so the Bronze Age is characterized by the fact that it's the rise of the early civilizations that we recognize or that we know from history pretty well, particularly those in Mesopotamia, but also the rise of Egypt and the rise of other major civilizations that are beginning to look like, in terms of technology and in terms of their organization, a little bit more like what we're accustomed today. Again, it's called the Bronze Age because it's all about bronze. And bronze, of course, is not a naturally occurring element. It's not a single element, but it is, meteorologically, it is something that could actually be put together that is primarily composed of copper. And so while iron is fairly abundant, it has a very high melting point. And as a result, it's very difficult to work and to fashion iron, even though it's more prevalent in nature. However, copper combined with either 10 to 15% tin or other metals can actually be fashioned into a more durable metal that is known as bronze. And so it takes copper, which has a very low melting point and smelting point, and adding to that the primary element that's normally used is tin. Combining those two things together enable the production of bronze. And bronze can be fashioned into a number of different artifacts and tools, but it can also be fashioned into weapons that are able to have a sharper, more durable edge, that are more durable in terms of being able to survive over periods of time and maintain those edges. And so bronze becomes the technology not only of tools and of decoration, which it still is even today, but it's also important because of what it enables from both a technology and a military standpoint in terms of the development of weapons and other elements that are based on metal that are not simply based upon stone. So the Bronze Age sees the rise of civilization and technology that's built around the bronze technology, and the bronze technology is the fashion of metalworking that combines copper along with tin and with other metals to be able to produce something that is durable and much more effective than just simple stone. So the approximate timing on the Bronze Age, roughly speaking, the early Bronze Age beginning about 3000 BC and carrying down through the Middle Bronze Age and then to the Late Bronze Age, which is identified being around the period of 1200 to around 1000 BC. So when we're talking about the Late Bronze Age here, we're talking about moving towards the time, and again, the date that we're going to sort of settle around as we talk about the Late Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age collapse is going to be the period of time from about 1200 BC to about 1150 BC. So when we're talking about the Bronze Age, obviously I've just described a little bit of what that is about. The Late Bronze Age being the latter period of that, and the collapse actually occurring during that period of time, a space of about maybe 100 to 150 years, roughly around a loose date. We'll use 1200 BC for that. And so, again, the Bronze Age is that. So what is the Late Bronze Age setting that leads up to the Late Bronze Age collapse? So the setting that we find at the end of the Bronze Age is actually come to be better understood by historians and archaeologists, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years, as being civilizations that we knew existed, but we've learned some things about the interactions among those civilizations, which has brought even more to light as a result of recent archaeology. But the time in question for the Late Bronze Age, and thus the period of time as we're leading up to the collapse, is we have a number of large cultures and civilizations that have come to be and are quite dominant. So these include the Greek kingdoms in Mycenae and even the Minoan area. We'll distinguish with those a little bit more as we talk about the what ifs that relate to what would have happened with some of these Greek areas if there had not been a late Bronze Age collapse. We have the Kassites in Babylonia, which have taken over to a great degree from the Sumerians, where the culture had arisen there. We have the Hittite Empire in Anatolia being the area that we think of as being modern Turkey, the large central area there of Asia Minor that's ruled by the Hittites, and they cover a very large territorial swath. We also have the New Kingdom period in Egypt. So Egypt is a thriving civilization along the Nile, what we think of as being traditional Egypt. Of course, the building of the pyramids and the other things have happened thousands of years before, but we still have a very bright, vibrant Egyptian empire and Egyptian civilization at the time that we draw towards the end of the Bronze Age. We also have Ugaritic society. Ugarit is a city, primarily in what we think of as being the very far north of modern day Lebanon, also into Syria, the area that we think of later as being Assyria. And then we have various states in the Levant. The Levant being the area occupied, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine today. So we have the Amorite states that are there as well, and all the particular other smaller people groups and smaller empires and areas of civilization that are existing. But the big players are the Mycenaean Greeks, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and then the Kassites, along with the Ugaritic states. These are the five really large civilization or cultures that exist as we're drawing up to the period here at the end of the Bronze Age. So that sets the stage for when is and what is the Bronze Age, particularly the late Bronze Age. And so now that sets us up to what is the collapse. And collapse is actually probably about the most appropriate word that I can imagine that would be used. This is not just an event. This is not just an isolated thing that happens in a very short period of time or to a very limited geographic scope as we draw towards the end of the late Bronze Age here. This is a very significant event that is widespread in terms of geography, certainly is widespread in terms of impact, and is widespread in terms of how it's going to impact history moving forward, which is what sets it up so nicely for what we do here on A Fork in Time, which is talking about what are the potential historical what-ifs of there not being a collapse. And so moving forward, we don't want to keep having to use the very long description, late Bronze Age collapse. We know we're talking about this particular period of time, the late Bronze Age, and we talk about the collapse. We're going to be talking about this event, big scale, mega scale event, which is comprised of a series of events that happened during this particular time frame. Again, placing that on a timeline, the timeline that we want to put in place here is going to be between approximately 1200 BC and 1150 BC. We'll see that it doesn't happen all in the space of 1 year, and it's spread out a little bit because of the geographic scope of what happens here. But a handy date that you might use to sort of think about it is sort of in the middle of that, which is 1177. And we might use that because of a historian and archaeologist Eric Klein, who's the author of a book, a very good book on the subject I would highly recommend. That's 1177 BC. That would be the year that civilization collapsed. And he uses that just for a number of different reasons as a representative potential year that sort of would represent the big epoch year of what's going on with the collapse. So when we say collapse, what happened? Well, we're talking about actually the destruction of virtually every city, port, or major collection of peoples all the way from Asia Minor, the area in Anatolia, and along what we think of today as the Turkish coast near the Aegean, on down through the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and all the way down to Egypt. The end result is, after the collapse, almost every major city is burned, razed, or destroyed, with many of them never actually being occupied again. The destruction here is not just physical in the sense of warfare or the actual destruction of property, but it's also the fall of civilizations, of trade relationships, and of cultures in such a way that there literally is a complete collapse of these major civilizations that have been dominant in some cases not just for hundreds of years but for 1,000 years or so. It's the collapse of most of the known world in the area of the Aegean and the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Near/Middle East. Everything that is known collapses, and that collapse happens in a very short period of time, and it is a complete collapse. Political systems, cultural connections, trade, everything comes to a halt. And so the collapse is substantial. Collapse is the right term to describe it. It's not just a series of isolated events that happen around the same time. There's a complete collapse. One of the interesting things that has also come along, I mentioned sort of understanding better about where things stood for the Late Bronze Age, is in 1982 there was actually the discovery of a shipwreck, a ship that had sunk that was off the southwestern coast of Turkey. And what's important about this vessel, which is dated somewhere around 1300 BC, so about 100 years before the Late Bronze Age collapse, is what was found on the vessel. It was clearly a larger vessel, a vessel that was capable of traveling over larger distances there in the Mediterranean, so it was not just a small coastal type of trade vessel. But what was found on that vessel, as Eric Klein describes it, this is part of what he also talks about in his book 1177, is that it's just a quote-unquote incredible assortment of goods. What is very clear from what is found in the vessel is that the trade that was going on and the trade that is represented by this shipwreck, and thus probably represents that there were many other ships like this that were engaged at the trade of the time, is the number of items and where they're coming from and what their sources are and how they must have interrelated with each other indicates that this period of time of the Late Bronze Age was not just when those civilizations and those empires that I mentioned were in a position of power, but that they were trading with each other and were interacting with each other in a scope that really wasn't understood before. In fact, one of the most interesting things about the cargo that's found on board the vessel actually speaks directly to the fact that we're in the Bronze Age. Remember that I talked about that bronze is the result of taking copper plus tin, and the ratio there is about 10 to 1, give or take, with tin representing about 10% of the composition of bronze, the rest of it being copper. So in the primary cargo hold of this ship is found 10 tons of copper from Cyprus and a ton of tin, in addition to all types of other finished and raw items from a number of different areas, not just around the area there around the Aegean and around Asia Minor, but coming as far away as Nubia in Africa, coming as far away potentially as back towards the eastern Mediterranean from the area that we think of as being the Levant, Canaan, those types of things. It had a number of different things, as well as items from maybe as far away as Italy, perhaps as far away as Iran. All of these things are on this one vessel, which suggests that there was a very robust set of trade that was happening across the entire, if you will, sort of known world, particularly of these empires that are part of the collapse here in the Late Bronze Age, these Bronze Age empires, that there was a tremendous amount of trade that was going on. It's also important to note the importance of that trade, and this is one of the things we will talk about in the collapse and the impact of the collapse, is that bronze is the result of copper and tin being combined together. Copper is not found everywhere, but it's fairly widespread and fairly easily accessible in terms of being able to be mined and to be extracted. Tin is actually, although it represents only 1/10 of what is needed to produce bronze, is far more rare. There are sources of tin that are easily accessible and that are well known in the British Isles. There are some that are in the area of parts of Italy. And then there are some that are as far away as Afghanistan. And what appears to be the case, the more that we've understood how everything interacts together in terms of this trade network, is the trading happened as a result of these cultures being stable and the result of all the benefits that existed because they were these powerful empires and cultures in the Late Bronze Age, but that the trade itself was part of what drove the Bronze Age. In other words, in order to make bronze, you needed tin. Tin was not available everywhere, and so it was necessary to trade items for it. So the actual technology that's driving the Bronze Age, the bronze itself is requiring that trade be an important part of what's happening in order to be able to have the materials to produce the bronze. And so there is a cyclical trading economy that takes place here in the late Bronze Age that requires trade in order for the materials to be brought together to produce the bronze, to produce the thing that is allowing the age to exist. And so one of the things that happens during the collapse is there's a collapse of this trading network. And so it becomes difficult for historians and archaeologists to really ascertain, did the events that led to the collapse take place and then the trade networks and the trading activity ceased as a result of that, or did something cause the trading to cease and that was another factor that led to the collapse? So it's a little bit of a circular argument about what is the cause and effect of the trade and its disruption, or the disruption of the trade causing the collapse. Did the collapse cause the disruption? Did the disruption cause the collapse? Or was it actually all of those factors working together? But what we do know is if you don't have this robust trade network that was set up that enabled all of this to happen, again, much of it represented by this one particular shipwreck that shows just how extensive and how widespread that network was. When that comes to a halt, the impact of that is pretty tremendous. And so the collapse is a collapse of many things, not just individual city-states, not just individual empires, not just individual cultures, but an entire, if you will, world economic order that has taken place. And one of the things that's often mentioned there is the fact that, in some ways, tin during that age may have served very much like modern fossil fuels, particularly oil, serves today. If oil wasn't able to flow from one location to another, if the trade didn't exist for that, the economy built around, like their modern economy is built around that petroleum resource. The Bronze Age economy was built around the trade of tin. If you couldn't trade for tin, you were no longer going to have a Bronze Age. That's an important part of what's going on there. So finally, let's talk about the causal factors for the late Bronze Age collapse, for the collapse. Well, the actual cause of the destruction seems to be, to a great degree, the people that archaeologists and historians know as the Sea Peoples. Now, who are the Sea Peoples? Well, the Sea Peoples are a confederation or a group of peoples that actually come and invade and attack the places that we've already talked about. They come to bring destruction to the areas of Anatolia, to the areas of Ugarit, to cities along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, and they fight at least two major conflicts with the Egyptians in the Nile Delta. Now, historians are not quite sure exactly who they are or where they come from. In fact, there's probably anywhere from about 8 to 10 different hypotheses, and it appears that they are not just one single group of people, but actually a collection of peoples. And we know this from some of the inscriptions that we find, for example, from the Egyptian pharaohs, particularly Ramses III, who gives a description about who some of them are by name, although archaeologists and historians are still trying to figure out what the sources of those people might be. It's possible that they come from as far away as Central Europe. They may come from parts of the Aegean or parts of the areas that we think of as being modern Greece. They could come from Sicily or Italy. They certainly manifest themselves as who we'll come to know later as the Phoenicians, but they definitely come from the sea. Now, why they are coming is also something that's a little bit of a question for historians. Are they coming simply because of conquest? Are they coming for other reasons? Or perhaps are they a form of refugees that are actually been forced to take on a military aspect because of what is happening to them, and they're actually coming to compete for resources? And so the actual destruction comes as a result of the Sea Peoples. We will spend some time talking about them as we talk about each of the individual what-ifs and sort of how they interact and how they continue to be. Because at least in one element, the Sea Peoples that we come to know as the Phoenicians, later perhaps become the Philistines as well, carry on, that ultimately perhaps having an influence of becoming Carthage, other things that actually happened in the real historical what did. So part of the historical what if will also be what would happen if there were no Sea Peoples, not just what would have happened to the various empires and late Bronze Age civilizations that collapsed, but what actually took their place would not have arisen. So that's several of the what ifs that we will explore will go along those lines. And so that'll be our opportunity to talk about who the sea people were or who they weren't in a little bit more detail. Now, I mentioned we're not quite sure what motivated them to be on the mode of conquest. But there are a number of potential factors that historians look at that may have been contributing factors to the collapse. And it's more and more the position, I think, that's being staked out now by historians and archaeologists that it was not one single cause of the collapse, but it's a combination of these factors working together and in some cases causing each other. And so I want to spend a little bit of time looking now at least at the big picture understanding of what might be the potential causes of the late Bronze Age collapse. Probably almost all of them to some degree center around, at least initially, some form of environmental cause. And so that manifests itself in the form of drought. There's a tremendous amount of evidence, a tremendous amount of scholarship that is now providing support for the concept that there were, during this period of time, some very widespread and prolonged periods of not just drought, but extreme drought. The type of drought that would make the survival by an agricultural civilization something that is very difficult to see being able to sustain itself. And as I mentioned, one of the characteristics, particularly of these late Bronze Age cultures, civilizations, and empires, was that they had perfected agriculture to a degree such that they were able to have city-states, large centralized areas of population. And so when you have the impact of drought cutting into the ability to do that, it's even more profound in its effect. And so whether that environmental change that led to the drought were just the normal patterns of short-term, medium-term, and long-term climatological change, which have happened and will continue to happen, it's a little bit unclear, but we definitely had a period of time there where there was extreme drought. One possible cause of the drought, though, might actually be something that is not directly related to climate per se, but the potential that this may have been incurred by other natural disasters. Particularly, I'm talking about volcanic activity here. There's one particular volcano in Iceland, the Hekla volcano, that may have had as many as 3 different eruptions in the period from approximately 1200 BC down to about 1050 BC and maybe a little bit later. And we know from other events like the Krakatoa event, and other events that have happened throughout history, that a large volcanic eruption, the ash that's spewed into the atmosphere, can have both short-range and near-term environmental impact, but also widespread global environmental impact. Krakatoa, the year after that, is known as the year without a summer, because as the ash cloud spread around, because of also its location near to the equator, spread around the entire globe because of wind patterns and dispersion patterns, there was a substantial decrease in the global temperature as a result of just that one event. So imagine a large-scale volcanic event occurring in Iceland that actually either very localized impact there on Europe and moving over into the area of the Mediterranean, or even more in a global sense, actually causes some of the climatological change that we've talked about here. Perhaps is the inducement for the thing that leads to drought or the inability to produce crops. And so again, one of the things that historians and archaeologists look at is the possibility that these sea peoples, let's say they derive from Central Europe, may have been driven out of Central Europe because of the impacts of either just a regular climate change that produced a drought, or the type of thing that this volcano in Iceland may have produced that caused them to need to move, to need to become essentially refugees looking for food sources. That led them into conflict with others. That conflict eventually caused them to form a confederation with others and then actually become the sea peoples that we know of from Egyptian literature and some of the other literature of some of the civilizations that were then fending off the attacks and the incursions. I'm just going to call it incursions, because if they're refugees, are they coming intentionally to settle, or are they coming to intentionally to attack? And so there's a number of different factors where ecological, climatological factors may have led to the starts of things that would cause the collapse. Once that happens, ruling authorities, for example, that are accustomed to not growing their own foodstuffs, but having a population and an agricultural economy that can cause them to survive. The tension that exists between those that are living in cities that can't produce their own foodstuffs, dependent upon those who have provided that to them that no longer can. The types of things that can go on inside an empire, go on inside a culture that can be brought on by an ecological change are also quite notable. And so there might have been an environmental impetus into what's going on here. There's some scholars that talk about over this period of time there may have been a large series of over multiple decades of increased seismic activity that potentially would tie back to this volcanic activity, where there were a large number of earthquakes. And so you have major urban centers that are hit by natural disasters in the form of earthquakes and other types of events that can also cause a disruption to society, can cause a disruption to trade inside of their individual civilizations, inside of the individual empires, and then having that spread out in a broader sense to the entire world of the Bronze Age. Another thing, again, that I mentioned here when we were talking about the importance of trade, is that once you have any of these types of things happening in local areas, so some of the climatological impacts, the ecological impacts, maybe even some of the natural disaster impacts are much more local, but once they've impacted the local scope and then that impacts this global trade network, is it no longer remains a local phenomenon. And so the earthquake activity in the Aegean, the earthquake activity perhaps that happens in Asia Minor, Turkey for example, causes things to go on in the Hittite Empire or in the Mycenaean Greek Empire, the types of things that are going on there. But once they are impacted, then their trade with Egypt, their trade with other areas of the world gets impacted. And again, in many cases, you may have had a 3- and 4-fold trade scenario here where good A was traded for good B, which was traded for good C, which was traded for good D, which led back to A. So, for example, your ability to get 10 may depend upon your ability to trade your thing of value for something of value for someone from someone else that you then in turn trade for your 10. Without 10, even though you have the copper, you can't produce the bronze. And so all of this works together to produce the potential for a collapse that can even come off of individual, more localized impacts that can sort of spread out through this entire network. The good news about having an interconnected global trade network is that you have an interactive and interconnected global trade network. The bad news is you have an interconnected global trade network. So if one part of that system fails, then you have the chance from that system being impeded that you can actually have a collapse. And so one of the things that historians and archaeologists talk about in a broader sense here is a broader systems collapse. And that's only the result of a system being in place, which again is both the good news, but the cutting edge of this is that it's also the bad news. There also may have been, and again, which comes first here, what's causal and what's the result of the cause, is there might have been a change in how warfare was conducted. Very much the late Bronze Age is very much the age of the chariot being the dominant weapon on the battlefield for many of these cultures. For the Egyptians, this is true for the Hittites. This is true for a great degree for the Kassites. These are civilizations that their military prowess is based upon the capabilities that exist with the chariot, which work very well with the characteristics of the Bronze Age and using bronze both as a material for the chariot itself and the type of weapons that can be used off the chariot as a weapons platform. What we do see during this period of time is apparently an alteration which appears to be the rise of infantry in such a way that was changing the nature of warfare. And this may be the result of new techniques that enabled bronze production of weapons to be done in such a way that that weapons, longer types of swords, as well as spears and other things can be brought forward for use by infantry groups, but also that there may have been the early introduction and some of the first use of iron that's also an element that's coming into play here. So it's possible that these sea peoples and the groups that they represent that are coming are not just coming seeking food, they're not just fleeing ahead of natural disasters and climatological impacts, but they may also be bringing with them the next age of weapons in the form of iron, and thus that changes the balance of power militarily, and the rise of the use of infantry and different types of spear configurations and sword configurations that allow infantry to become one of the dominant modes of military force as compared to the chariot. And so again, trying to figure out what the causes are here. The cause ultimately for much of the destruction, again, the cause are the sea people. But what causes the sea people? So it's the cause of the cause that's an interesting part of what needs to be explored here. So I hope that you've appreciated and enjoyed this sort of high-level overview that will set the stage for what we're looking at as we look at the collapse. And this will be a helpful primer to sort of use as we go down the various what-if scenarios. The next episode will be one of those what-if scenarios where we will take a particular closer look at one of the civilizations that's impacted, how it collapsed, and how without the collapse, without the Bronze Age collapse, things might have been different both for that civilization and for other successor civilizations as well. So again, once again, we want to say thank you for joining us here on this special series that we're launching off with this introductory episode here on A Fork in Time. And with it, we hope that you stick with us and enjoy and interact with the rest of the series as we move forward. Of course, we want to say thanks to you as our patrons, and we appreciate your support. Thanks. Welcome to episode number 1 of The Room Where It Happened, the new podcast from the same folks that brought you A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don, sitting in the host chair today, but as we'll discover as we begin this journey down the new podcast, The Room Where It Happened, we're going to have lots of folks that are sitting in lots of different chairs. That's sort of the concept behind the podcast, and we certainly are glad that you found us here for our inaugural episode. You probably found us, potentially, as being a listener of A Fork in Time. We've been talking about getting this launched here for the last couple of months as we slide into the summer of 2021. You may have found us some other way. However you found your way in, welcome, and we hope that you find it a place that you come to frequently and a place that you enjoy. Today's first episode is going to be a little bit different in the sense that it's going to provide an introduction into the format of the podcast, or at least the way we envision the podcast being. It'll be a work in progress, no doubt about that, very much as A Fork in Time has been. But also, you'll understand as we describe the format why it's going to be a little bit different today in the sense that it actually sets up what will be episode number 2. So, just to give you a little background, for those of you that know A Fork in Time, you know that we take the alternate history approach to history. Now, very often when we're doing our alternate history approach, the what-ifs, we often have to talk about the what-dids. In fact, one of the dangers that Alexis and I have grown through the podcast here over the first couple of years on A Fork in Time is realizing that sometimes it's easier to dwell or hang around in the what did because it's so interesting without getting over into the what if. And so that's when we came up with the concept of The Room Where It Happened. Is a podcast that is not bound by the what if alternate history genre. There's no doubt that we'll get into that from time to time because it's a good way to think through and to think about historical events, is to not only talk about what did happen, but what could have happened, what might have happened, what the impacts of the actual event happening or the event not happening would have been. But the concept on The Room Where It Happened is to actually dwell more on the what did. Talk about the significance of the what did, find out new interesting things about the what did, and basically more of a true, pure history podcast. In fact, sort of our subtitle here on The Room Where It Happened is the idea that we want to be history from inside the room. So let's talk a little bit about the inspiration for the name and also sort of, again, part of the concept that we'll be taking here. The concept that we will launch into each of the particular topics around is going to be this idea of the quote-unquote room. I think most often that will be a physical room of some size. It may be small, it might be a closet or a phone booth, or it might be as large as something that is theoretical in terms of being a room like a stadium or theater of battle or something like that. But generally speaking, I think it will be a contained, closed space that most of the time will probably have a door or set of doors. And the idea is that we're going to launch into and look at these particular historical events from the perspective of what went on in that room, the quote-unquote room where it, whatever it is in history, actually happened. For those of you that are fans of A Fork in Time and certainly probably fans of Broadway musicals, you certainly probably already know where we derived the title from. It's a derivative off of one of the songs from Lin-Manuel Miranda's very, very, very groundbreaking and very, very popular Hamilton. In that particular case, one of the musical numbers is about a quote-unquote room where it happened. In fact, there's a couple of numbers that work around this theme. The idea of the people that are in the room get to make the decisions and the people that are outside the room don't get to make the decisions. Although as we go through some of the topics that we're going to explore here on the podcast, we'll discover that, yeah, normally it is probably the folks that are in the room, but sometimes it's the folks that aren't in the room that may be the big factors, the big movers in the particular historical event that we're talking about. And so it felt appropriate for our first episode to actually focus on the primary historical event that particular musical number from the musical Hamilton is about, and that's the room where it happened in the case of the Compromise of 1790. What is sometimes known, it's known by a number of different names. It's sometimes called the dinner table bargain. And so that's actually going to be our first topic. Couldn't imagine doing anything else, since that in some way was the inspiration for the title of the podcast as well as the concept of the podcast, so it only felt fitting that our first topic would actually be the Compromise of 1790, which is also sometimes called the dinner table bargain. So here is generally what the format of the podcast is going to be. Actually, what we're going to do in most instances is we're going to introduce the topic. We're going to call the topics rooms. So for example, room 1 will be the Compromise of 1790. The next topic that we cover, topic 2, will be room 2. Easy enough to figure out what we're doing there. I don't need to go on and give additional examples. But what we intend to do is we intend to introduce the room at the end of one of our episodes. So it will sort of be a teaser, a primer of what's coming up next. And so that will be often, you might want to think about thinking back towards what we do inside of A Fork in Time, where we do the historical what did before we talk about the what if. In this case, we're going to talk about the historical what did in the sense of a broad general understanding above what this historical event was, where the room was, when the room was, who was in the room, that type of thing. It's the scene setting, the stage setting part of what we're going to do. The reason we're going to introduce that at the end of an episode is we really are hoping to try to make the room where it happened a much more interactive experience, which is tough to do, candidly, with a podcast. And so what we'll do by introducing the topic is that will give you a chance to go and visit a number of the different places that we set up on our website. Perhaps it's on the Facebook page for the room where it happened. A number of different places, and give us your thoughts on that particular topic. The types of things that you think are insightful about that. Basically just giving us all types of information that comes out of your head about it. It could be maybe interesting facts that may not be in the public domain, or pointing us to a website that may give us a little more insight, an article that's been written, an essay that's been written, whatever the case might be, giving us some feedback on the actual topic. Now again, that introduction is going to be fairly brief. It's going to be high level. Most of the time it'll probably be drawn from like a first 2 or 3 paragraph of a Wikipedia page kind of approach. But the intent of the room where it happened, yeah, nice little voice break there. The intent of the room where it happened is then to go deeper into that topic. And the way that we will go deeper is in the subsequent episode, when it is the main part of the episode that follows. At that point, we'll be inviting in our guests, some of the folks you already know, folks like Chris Coppola, Brett Frost, others, Dean Rogers, some of the others that are out there, Eric Rush, names that you probably recognize, and some others that have decided to come along for the ride as well. And perhaps that may even include you, because the concept will be that when we come back for the next episode is we will have an open, freewheeling discussion. Sometimes that might turn into debate. Sometimes that might turn into exploratory questions, whatever it might be, where we have the thoughts that are coming from all of those various hosts, and they will be commenting on and being focused by the things that you, the listeners, have put in through that feedback process. So let me see if I can describe this again in much simpler terms, maybe much shorter. We're going to introduce a topic at the end of one episode. Give some time, because we're only going to be looking to produce an episode about once a month here on The Room Where It Happened. For the subsequent episode, which will actually be recorded about 2.5 to 3 weeks after the episode where the topic is suggested is released, during that period of time is the opportunity for our listeners to provide feedback, thoughts, comments, questions, insights, all the things that go with that. And then when we do the subsequent recording, we will be looking at those and incorporating those into the discussion that happens at that time. By the way, if you haven't thought about being a host on the show, become part of the cast of the show, if you will, or one of the talking heads, that's your opportunity to say, hey, I really know a lot about that. I'd love to be part of that. And so there'll be enough time not only for you to submit comments or thoughts, but actually submit the fact that you would actually like to participate on that episode. Our goal here is to have a very wide and diverse group of people with different philosophical understandings, different backgrounds, different historical areas of expertise, different insights that we come to bring around these particular events. And the idea is to really come from each episode knowing more about that event than we did before. Hopefully finding out that there's something surprising that we thought we knew, maybe that we didn't, or that we didn't know and suddenly realize, yeah, when I think about it, I guess I knew that all along. So that's the concept in the big picture about what the room where it happened is going to be. That made sense in roughly about 9.5 minutes worth of explanation. But that's why this episode is going to be a little bit different, because we're not going to jump directly into the topic. We plan to have the recording on this first topic here in about a week and a half to 2 weeks subsequent from when this episode drops. So what this episode will be, in addition to providing that background information, that introduction, if you will, to the format of the room where it happened, is this episode will actually introduce Room 1. Again, Room 1 is Topic 1, and as I talked about, that's going to be the Compromise of 1790. We'll do that, or I'll do that, right after the break. We hope that you stick with us.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to episode number 1 of The Room Where It Happened. Good to have you back with us here today. As I mentioned before the break, the rest of the episode here will be setting up Room 1, Topic 1, for The Room Where It Happened, which is the Compromise of 1790. So just as a reminder, the United States comes into being as a new nation under the Constitution. It had existed under the Articles of Confederation after winning its independence. But it comes into its existence under the Constitution with the election of 1788 and the swearing in of its first president, George Washington, in early 1789. So here we are in 1790. The government is new and a lot of things are still being worked out. And so one of the interesting things that comes to exist as we move from the spring and into the summer of 1790 is a situation where there's a clash or a deadlock that's happening on a couple of different issues. One of those issues is a bill that has been put forth and is being advocated by the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, that basically is about what's going to happen with the assumption of the debts from the Revolution that were issued by the states, because they were the entities at the time, the states, during the Revolution itself. And so the act that's before Congress is what's known as the Funding Act or the Assumption Act. And what Hamilton is seeking to do is to actually have the federal government take responsibility for these state debts by issuing federal debt that would pay off and would bring together, would consolidate the various state debts that would then be owed by the new federal government. And so what he is pushing for is the concept of assumption. A number of different reasons for that. We'll talk about that in episode 2 when we actually get down into the reason for it. But that's one of the things that is a big part of his plan, trying to be the architect for the financial structure of the new country and how it's going to work. The other particular matter that's reached some loggerheads, if you will, in the Congress is the fact that the Constitution called for the creation of a capital area, a federal district where the capital will be located. One of the things that the Founding Fathers did in the Constitution was wanted to have a situation where the capital would not be in any one particular state. It would be in a unique, separate area, what we now know as the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., that would be distinct from any state. But where that was going to be or how that was going to be was not yet fully decided. And in fact, as we draw in towards the period here in early 1790, about 16 different concepts have been put forward for where that would be, ranging from New York to Philadelphia to other places. And so that's something that has not yet been decided. And of course, what happens in the Compromise of 1790, the quote-unquote room, the room where this happens is actually at a dinner party that's actually hosted by Jefferson. Jefferson is the Secretary of State, so he's an influential person, obviously, inside of the first administration's cabinet. He's also, of course, known for being one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, and he's come back to assume this position after being the envoy to France during the period of the Articles of Confederation. So that's why he's not holding any elected office. It's an appointed office that he's holding, the Secretary of State position, which is one of the three first federal cabinet level officers, even before they sort of officially called it the cabinet. But he's holding that level, and he's very closely aligned with James Madison. James Madison, most famously known sort of by the epitaph of the father of the Constitution, and both of them happen to be Virginians. Hamilton happens to be from New York. And so they have a vested interest in being opposed to the idea that the new federal government would assume any debts. That was very much not their political philosophy when it came to what the role of this federal government would be. So they opposed Hamilton philosophically, but they also had an interest in hoping that the capital would be located somewhere in or near Virginia. Now, of course, we know at the end of the day, Washington, D.C. is extracted from a territory that had been part of Maryland, but sits right on the border with Virginia, and so we know what actually happens. But what supposedly happens in this room, which is sometime around June 20th of 1790, give or take, it may not have been a single meeting, is at this dinner party a compromise was struck. And the compromise that was struck was that the votes necessary for Hamilton to get passage of his Assumption Act would be delivered by Madison and Jefferson, particularly by delivering critical key votes from Virginia, one of the largest states, and thus one of the largest delegations inside of the House of Representatives. And in exchange for that, Hamilton would be willing to push for and advocate that the capital would not be located in New York, but would actually be located where it ends up being, in what becomes the District of Columbia, there on the Potomac, on the border between Virginia and Maryland. And so that's the deal that struck in the quote-unquote room, and that's what happened. So when we come back on episode 2, we're going to dig into that and understand what that's about. How important was that? There are historians that argue it is perhaps one of the three most important quote-unquote compromises in U.S. history. We can talk about whether it fits that bill, but the Missouri Compromise is often mentioned, the Compromise of 1850. You know, there are other compromises in American history. In fact, I think one of the topics most definitely will be on episode 2 is the role of compromise in government. And one of the things I also should mention is the room where it happens, while we're not going to be overtly political or overtly partisan, we're going to be a little bit more willing to allow partisan things to slip into the discussions here within balance, because I think that can be done in a way that is not argumentative, that is instructive. But, you know, for example, what is the nature of compromise as it existed in 1790, and what is the nature of compromise as it exists in 2021? I think we will discover, at least from my perspective, they're different. But you may disagree with me, and some of the other panelists may disagree with me. So it's not too late to put in your thoughts on that if you want to. So hopefully I've done a good job today of at least setting up what the room where it happened is going to be, setting up the initial room number 1, topic number 1, which is going to be the Compromise of 1790. And now this is the part where I encourage you to actually go and interact with us. So let me tell you where you can do that. You can go to www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The mothership is still the website. When you get to the website, a couple of different things you can do. You can see the link that's there in the top bar that'll take you to the room where it happened. There you can get a little bit more information about the room where it happened, some of the other things that are there, actually a link there to join the room where it happened team, if that's what you want to do. And certainly we welcome and encourage those that still want to be a part of the podcast. The other thing that you can do, though, is actually there's an option there known as the forum. So one of the things we've gone back to doing here on the website, it won't just be for the room where it happened, although I think that's primarily where you will see most of the action, is we've reestablished a forum, like other forums that you see online, which is a place to actually go in, make comments, ask questions, do posts, that type of thing. And you'll find that there's already a particular post that's there on the forum, which is under the category for the room where it happened. And you'll see room number 1, the Compromise of 1790, also known as the dinner table deal. And so in comments or responses back to that is where you can put questions, comments, links to interesting facts. Again, just whatever you as a listener thinks would make episode 2 better, from us having seen that, thought about that, being questioned by that, whatever the case might be. And so you can go, again, to the website, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Follow the link to the forum. There you'll find the room number 1 topic. You can create new topics, but we certainly encourage you to collect your topics there and to reply and interact. Again, we're going to ask our folks to be respectful. We're going to ask you to engage in thoughtful exchange and intercourse. That doesn't mean that you have to agree. It just means that if you disagree, please do so agreeably. The other thing that you can do is in the show notes for this particular episode here on the podcast, there will be links to these various things, including a direct link to the forum. And if you want to, if it's just easier for you to interact with us on social media, in this case it's Facebook, then there's the link that's also in the show notes that will take you to the Room Where It Happened podcast page on Facebook, which is also going to be found at Facebook/The Room Where It Happened podcast. And that's a long series of characters to put together. Again, there'll be a link down in the show notes. And so we really encourage you to go and do that. Give us some thoughts, give us some suggestions, point us to some good sources, all the things that'll make our discussion among the panel the first time that we gather a panel together on episode number 2 to discuss room number 1. We'll do so in a way that's a little bit more informed and a little bit more challenged. And of course, following the concept, sort of a domino theory kind of approach, at the end of episode number 2, we will introduce room number 2, which we'll then cover on episode number 3. So it'll always be one-off. You will actually see the particular topic introduced on the episode that's before it, and that's okay. Actually may renumber this episode so that it's sort of the new 000 or something like that, so that it goes in a different order. Probably would be easier if the episode numbers matched up with the rooms, but we'll see how it plays out. Either way, we ask you to subscribe to the feed. That way you'll make sure you catch every new release, and understand that the Room Where It Happened is intended to be a longer form podcast. And so it's going to run, each episode will run longer, but we'll be doing them less frequently. What we envision right now is a once a month release schedule. We may find that we're able to do a little bit faster cadence than that. If we can, we certainly will. But if we can't, we want to focus on the quality and not the quantity. So again, appreciate you joining us here for episode number 1. I've been excited to get to the point of actually recording this. And so as I'm closing it down here, I'm going to say once again, thank you for being part of our family of podcasts, and thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.